Welcome to another episode of Management Muse. I'm your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my husband and co-host, Jeffrey Tumlin.
Yellow! Welcome to the podcast where we try to inspire better work performance. Thanks for listening.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. Today we wanted to announce that we're going to try a live stream coming up. It'll be on Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, 2025. So if you can, grab your margarita and we'll talk some management. Today we would like to ask you for a little bit of feedback. So to make that conversation interesting to you, we're looking for what is currently challenging you at work, either managing yourself or managing others. You can leave them down in the comments section, or you can check the show notes and we'll have a link to where you can leave us some of your ideas for that conversation. Now on to the show. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on Management Muse. I am your host, Cindi Baldi, and this is my co-host, Jeffrey Tumlin.
Yellow.
We are in the room today. We're going to be talking about management with Kip Wilson. Geoff, you want to give them the heads up on what they're in for?
Yep. Kip's my roommate from West Point, and he went on after his time in the Army and decided to join his wife's family's business, and then has created his own family business after that. And so he's going to tell us what is the secret ingredient you're looking for if you're in a family business to have a good sense of if it's likely to be successful for many years. And if you're listening to this podcast and thinking about joining a family business, this is what you should be looking for. He's got the goods, the secret sauce, and he learned it the hard way.
Yes, I did.
Yes, he did.
All right, Kip. So where would you like to start?
I'll just give a brief description and how I got involved in a family business. I do work in a family business. It started with my wife's family business. After I got out of the Army in 2001, after fulfilling that obligation, her dad invited us to move back to the small town where she had grown up. And he had a family business going on. A couple of my brother-in-laws were currently working in the business when we came. We do rural telecommunications. Originally, it was your local telephone company is what we do. It's more internet and broadband now today. But we provide telecommunication services based upon facilities that we own in rural communities, generally where there wouldn't be a business case to deploy telecommunication services, and then regulated usually by some form of a state public utility or public service commission, as well as the FCC.
So you did your time in the Army, got out, and then were basically offered a job in the ongoing family business as
Correct.
An in-law. Did you feel like at that time you were an insider in the business, or you were coming in as an outsider?
I think I felt like I was coming in as an outsider. I did have two brother-in-laws involved. And so it was pretty clear that they wanted this to be a growing family business and to bring folks in. But, certainly I knew my in-laws well and I knew my brother-in-laws well, but, I was coming from a very different background after being an Army officer. They'd all been involved, anywhere from 2 to 10 years. In my father-in-law's case, he'd been doing it since he'd been in high school. And so, it was a very different situation to try to crack that and define your role and to get involved. So initially I felt like it was an outsider, but that probably transitioned within a few years. We were a growing company. And so as we added more employees and as the company was changing and the roles and responsibility was given to you, it became pretty clear, within a few years that, I was on the inside.
And go through some of your calculus. At the time, you could have done anything. Could have stayed in the Army, could have gotten a job somewhere. For our listeners, some of whom may at some point in their future think about joining a family firm, what was some of your calculus to the best that you can remember for here's what I get if I join, here's why I should, here's what I'm worried about, and what kind of tilted you in favor of, basically, to put it bluntly, since I'd known you up until, I know you since you were 18, pretty much you charted your own course. And then you made this turn and decided to go into something that was already someone else's.
And it didn't seem like it was really your wife's choice. Like she would have been happy with you staying in the military.
Yeah. I think, my wife, the little town we live in is a town of 300. All right. And I don't know if any of your listeners come from communities that small, but when you grow up in a real small town like that, oftentimes you're very hesitant to move back, concerned that nobody will really believe you've grown up and will continue.
I think that's a valid concern.
It was a very valid concern that we took into consideration. I think to me, to go through some of the calculus, one of the businesses that they had gotten involved in, and so they had their core business, which at that time was mostly voice telephone, landline telephone service. And they were starting to get into this, the late 90s, and they're starting to get initially into the internet world. And my brother-in-law, my father-in-law had bought rights to sell DirecTV. And they had done that for a few years. Had built up, quite a successful little business, and then were able to spin it off and sell it to a larger provider. And so when I saw that, I saw this opportunity involved in the rural telecommunications space, and they made a very large sum of money, which, I grew up, without a family that was particularly wealthy and had just served in the Army. And so that looked like to me a very lucrative opportunity to do something similar, that this model seemed to be in front of my eyes, that we develop something, and then once it becomes successful, you sell it off to someone who's trying to, bring it all together nationally, so to speak.
And so the following isn't a trick question. I don't mean it that way, but you saw an opportunity. Was the family business part of it a pro or a con?
I thought it was a pro. I thought it was very good. My father-in-law was extremely generous with the equity, and wanted us to get involved and to feel an ownership for it. As time's gone on, and into some of your managers and owners of family businesses, I'm not so convinced you want to do that as quickly as perhaps he did in some ways. I think sometimes, when you're making decisions whether or not to give ownership, you need to be real sure before you do it, because once you do it,
right,
it's done.
You can't back it off.
Yeah.
And things have worked out fine for us, but it has had the potential to create heartburn here and there for him, and for others. And so in my calculus, I was thinking, all right, I can get ownership. They're generous with doing it. I was confident that, whatever we do it well. They had already done that, and so we'd seen success happen. And so I was confident we could replicate that in new technologies or new things that came along, to be involved in. Other calculus to me, the opportunity to be a part of a rural community and everything that came with it was very attractive to me. I'm very communal, and I had an opportunity, and the business, my father-in-law's vision for the business, one of the goals was to bring benefit to the rural community. That we use this business to hire people that otherwise wouldn't live in a community like that. Then they can serve on the school board. When you're putting people who are professional engineers on your school board, and you're in a rural community of 400, and you have accountants and engineers and, white collar professionals and that sort of thing, that helps that community to develop and to improve. These are folks that value education, and they'll put pressure on the school board to improve things and to make them better. And I really bought into that vision. It really was attractive to me that not only are we in a family business that's going to be successful and we're generating wealth and having a comfortable lifestyle, but we're doing something that's making the world a better place. And we're using the resources that we have to that end. And I really identified with that.
And to the best of your ability to recollect it, when do you feel like you made the switch from outsider in a family business to insider?
After I got there, one of the first things they did shortly after I arrived, they had come in contact with some folks that were running a municipally owned telephone network in a community in Utah, a few hours south of us. And I showed up, and we were driving down to go look at the network. We were helping them with billing systems and things that they needed to do to properly run, at that time, a local telephone company. And my father-in-law was savvy enough to understand that they were providing telephone service, buying $1 million switch, $1 million worth of electronics, that based upon their customer counts, they were never going to be able to pay back. And so he's like, this is a problem, and that eventually there's going to have to be a solution. And he recognized that probably the only solution is a private provider who could get the universal service and some of the revenues, cost recovery revenues that exist in our industry, would have to buy out the city and take it over and do it properly. And he figured if he's helping them along the way, he'd be the first one to get the opportunity to do that. And so I got introduced that, and he said, and I have no clue how that's going to happen. He says that, this is very unique, uncharted waters. And he goes, so this is your baby, Kip. And so, it took me time to figure out. I got with consultants. We kind of marked out a plan to get this through the Utah Public Service Commission and the FCC. And then it took us a few years, but we had that thing up and running, after I'd been there about 5 years. And I think when I was running that company, that's really when I had responsibility. I had obligations. I was no longer, just hanging out in the boardroom. But when we went and had board meetings, I actually had things to talk about of a company that I was running. And I think it's when I had that responsibility that I made the switch. Then I knew, all right, I knew I was part of the family when I married their daughter, but now I'm part of the family business because, part of the kingdom is under my operational control. And I have an obligation, not just to myself, but to them, because they're the shareholders, to make this successful.
You're bringing in value.
Yes. At that point, yeah, that's a good way to put it. At that point, what I was doing was generating wealth for the whole family rather than me just standing by.
If you were going to give advice to somebody who was thinking about, who's an outsider and thinking about joining a family business, what would it be?
I was not the offspring of my in-laws, obviously. And
we would hope not.
No. I mean, we're
this is Utah,
we're pretty close in Mormon communities,
right.
but we're not quite that close. I think it's a great deal. I'm very much an advocate of it. I enjoyed the fact that I knew that I had a meaningful relationship outside of business with my fellow, eventual fellow shareholders and my original boss and the board, and all those things. And the way we operate originally is we had this family company, and then it consisted of many companies, and each one would have a general manager who ran it, and they would report to the board. So I would have been the general manager of one company, but also sat on the board for 2 or 3 or 4 others. And so I think it's good. My wife's family are great people, and that made it easier. I do know that there's been challenges with family companies, and certainly we've had our own. But when you're with people you trust, you know them well, you trust their values, you know that they're decent people, that they're really not greedy, but yet at the same time they do want to generate wealth. I think it's a great way to start your career in a lot of ways. Coming out of the Army and the first job in the business world, you can make mistakes. They're certainly they don't look past them, but they believe in you and you trust them. And I think that's the perfect, and that's a good atmosphere to learn, where you believe that the people that you're working for have your best interests at heart in a lot of ways. You feel like you can then take risks and do things because, there is more to it than maybe just the bottom line. And I enjoy that aspect of family businesses. I talked about, the commitment that we made to the community where we live, that we wanted to improve it, but also knowing that you've got values in common, that the people you're working with, it's not just about money at that point. And I think that that's an important thing to realize. If you're in a family business, not every decision is always the perfect business decision. Yeah. All right. You need to understand that, and you need to be at peace with it, because that thing's going to rear its ugly head all over. You may have people working in it who don't contribute as much as others, but you've got to see to it that they're financially taken care of, and all these obligations that come with it. There's a certain idealism in that appealed to me, that we are taking care of one another, that this is above and beyond just the generation of money.
I think I want to circle back
Okay.
and point out that I think one critical thing that people have to consider when they're thinking about whether or not they want to join a family business is, one, what you said, like you actually have a good relationship with your folks, with your in-laws, because the first problem is that, this is a big gamble, and you're not only gambling on your wife, but your livelihood is gambling on your relationship with your in-laws.
And your relationships. I mean, you've got to be mature and know that they're all mature and stable, and that the relationships can withstand the stress that come from, running businesses together.
Right, because you are going to have friction.
Yeah, you absolutely are.
And then I think the other thing that I would want to pull out for people to consider is you didn't have experience in the telecom,
No.
but you did have external value. You knew you had your military career. You knew what that was. You knew what that value was at, management experience. You weren't just going into a family business without any sense of your worth. And so it was, I think, in that regard, easier to be able to evaluate whether or not you were even getting a fair shake. It's also, I think, easier for the family members then to actually treat you fairly, because there is a value attached to you that you could actually get externally, versus somebody who is coming into a family business, whether it's their own family or they're joining a family business, and they're coming straight at it without really having a market value that's established. I think there's always that tension between, especially in a small town, because I also grew up in not quite so small of a town, but a small town. There's always that belief in the small town that, you just were brought into the business because you're family.
Yeah.
And not because you're qualified. And that gets harder for both external parties and your own family to believe. Like they can kind of treat you like they're doing you a favor when like you're working your tail off for them. And that all of that gets harder for them to do when you have an established external value that's been set up by having other experiences in other places. And also, like, you learn stuff with working in the other places that you can then bring back. So you're not so institutionalized to that particular family, that family's culture. Like, you're actually able to see maybe some of the things that are, maybe not great, but could be fixed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great comment. My wife's grandfather bought the company. And so I guess my wife's father, my father-in-law, would be second generation, and I'm part of the third generation. And, you hit on a few things, like going forward, it's a natural progression that, you have family businesses in the kingdoms sometimes break up to some extent for equity to go to different family members. And we're doing some things like that. And if my children or their spouses were to get involved, I have some expectations that I would like them to work outside of the family company for a certain amount of time, for many of the reasons you hit on. Specifically, their own individual confidence. I think it's very important that they know themselves that while I may work in a family business, I could have worked outside. All right. I don't need to rely on this. I have worth. I have proven I've been hired as a manager by people that weren't related to me, because the reality is other people probably see my kids and their spouses different than I do. That's just a reality. You can't lie to yourself. Every human being is going to have that, a very favorable opinion of their own children and the people.
Well, we hope.
Yeah, preferably.
I think the norm.
Yes, and who they choose to marry. And so one thing is it's good for them. Two, you talk about employees. Employees, if you want your company to be successful long term, which is what I think most family companies want, it's got to be run by competent and capable people. All right. And the employees have got to believe that the leadership is competent and capable. If they don't believe that, they're going to leave you, They're always looking to go someplace else.
They're going to look for the loopholes and take advantage
of them. And so you need to have employees who believe that the people running the company, the members of the family, if that's the positions you reserve for members of the family, that they know what they're doing. And if you grow up in comfortable circumstances, silver spoon in your mouth, and you move straight into it, that can be a potential issue, whether or not there's genuine respect for that member of the family. And so both their own confidence as well as their legitimacy in the eyes of the employees, I think it's important that they get some management experience outside the company before they come in. And especially if they're my own kids. If it's, my sons or a daughter-in-law, that's a little bit different. They may have outside experience. I know what my kids experience. I know, the level of lifestyle they had and those sort of things. And when you make decisions running a company, I harken back to the military. When Geoff and I were Army officers, at every level that you're a platoon leader or a commander, you have a right-hand man that's either a platoon sergeant, first sergeant, or a command, sergeant major who, started in the Army as an E1, mowing the grass and doing the crappy detail jobs that need to be done. And so when you make a decision that's going to impact a military unit, they can tell you how that's going to influence the lowest guy on the chain. Well, we don't do that in the business world because we're somewhat of a slave to the almighty dollar. All right. And so you don't have that to rely upon. And so if you take a person who grew up, in a family that owns a successful company, they probably did some odd jobs growing up and did it, but they really don't know if you make a bad decision, how that's going to impact everybody that works for you. And their circumstances are such that they can probably insulate themselves from the consequences of that poor decision. And so I think not only for their self-confidence and legitimacy in the eyes of the employees, but for the future and the health and vitality of the company, they need to get some experience in the outside world so that they know how bad decisions impact people. Because if you've worked in a company where your management has made poor decisions and you've had to deal with the consequences of that, you're going to be less likely, I think, to repeat those mistakes within the family company.
I think there's at least an awareness.
Right? Absolutely.
Because, the danger of growing up in a successful family business where there's, a nice lifestyle has been created for you is that you don't really understand the financial struggle of the people who are working for you. And it should be hard to fire people. You are messing up their life.
Absolutely.
You should feel responsibility for making sure that their paychecks are on time.
If you're
and
going
clear.
to cut health insurance, and things like that. I mean, you've got to be aware how these things impact people's lives, or your company won't be successful because the people that work for you don't feel a part of it. They don't feel that you have their best interests at heart. And if you want a successful company, I think that's absolutely necessary. You've got to have people that buy into you, that I'm working for people who have my best interests at heart. And so I want their company to be successful because I'm a part of that and I'm going to share in that success.
And I think I'm just tagging on to that comment. I think it's also really hard for your employees to feel that connection because the family business is very much connecting to a family.
Yes.
And it's really hard to feel that connection to that family if you feel like their life is so different from yours that there's no resemblance between yours and their life. They do feel like they're a world apart. And that is hard to actually connect and identify with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, adding dynamic from my experience, we're in a very small town. The town's 300, but the greater Valley community is 500. We're in a community where we know everything about each other. Many relatives who aren't involved in the family company who come from the same stock, so to speak. And so you've got to be aware of the circumstances of your life. And I don't think that doesn't mean you hide it, or pretend it doesn't exist. but I think having the legitimacy that you add value to the company in the eyes of the employees goes a long way to bridging that gap. I mean, there are other things I advise, successful family-owned companies to do. You need to create ways to share that wealth and to share that benefit with the people that are helping you to grow your company.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned that in an indirect way with talking about like basically you're there to better the community.
Yes.
And I know that you also do perky things too that are very nice that people couldn't have or would be very challenging for them to have without sort of the hand up. But yeah, I mean, they have to see that not only is their job a good job and that they're respected and treated, but that overall the community is actually benefiting from the existence of the company.
Yeah. And that is, I think are really at the core of ours. One way I look at it is, this company and it continuing to be successful is creating great opportunities for my children, and hopefully they manage things well if they get involved, and their children, and et cetera. And something we often ask ourselves is, what can we do to create these opportunities for the children of our employees who attend the local public school in the little town where we live? And what can we do to create opportunities for them? And that's something we take very serious is our donations to the school, and trying to create better academic programs or even technical programs for the kids who grow up in that community that hopefully that they can use to as a ladder to benefit their own life. And you're trying to take this concept of the family company and grow the family. I mean, we need to live in the real world. If you're not a member of the family, you're not going to get as much benefit as the family members. And I think you have to be honest with people. Your employees are smart. They really know what's going on. You may think you can pull the wool over their eyes, but you can't. All right. And I think most people can respect that and understand it, that you're not going to be part of the family, but our company is a family, and we create opportunities and benefits for the family members of our employees.
Hello, Musers. Now it's time for commercial break.
I would say, I dare say, this is one of our most popular topics.
It's hard.
Yeah, difficult conversations training for managers. So if you're a manager and you want to know how to talk to somebody whose performance is all of a sudden dropped and you're not sure why, and you're worried there's something going on at home and you don't know how to bring that up, or there's another manager that you don't get along with, and haven't seen things eye to eye for a couple of years, but you're trying to figure out if there's a way to bury the hatchet. These kind of difficult conversations where you need the other party, that you don't know the answer, you're kind of trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but the issue is sensitive, the stakes are high. These are the kind of conversations where having a plan and having a good way to start the conversations can really help you increase the chances of being able to find a workable truce, or even sometimes potentially a solution. Probably the most popular training we do, difficult conversations training. It's 3 parts. We give you an assessment of some of your styles for handling conflict. We give you some tools for starting the conversations and keeping them going to try to put together a solution. And then we give you an opportunity to actually, with some coach, getting some feedback, practice some of these conversations and help you more quickly build your competencies in these areas. Difficult conversations training, you can get it at ondemandleadership.com, ondemandleadership.com. So let's say that I'm an outsider.
Okay.
And I'm smart, and
you are smart.
Thank you.
Jeff is smart.
Thank you. And I'm trying.
Everybody has college roommates. All right. And most of us have college roommates who've read books. I had a college roommate who writes books.
Well, there you go. Thank you. And so let's say I'm an outsider. I'm not in the family, but I'm ambitious. I'm smart, and I'm in the area, and you've got a really attractive business. But I get in there and start talking with you and some of the other folks, and I realize I can come in, but I'm never going to actually be sitting. The control is actually going to be in the family.
That is correct.
And I'm never going to have that level of control. What's your persuasive case for continuing to attract the kind of talent you need to include? And I know that not everybody cares about how much control am I going to have, how much authority am I going to have a say. But a small percentage of key positions you probably need to fill with people.
Yes. You want to
like
fill.
That.
You want to fill key positions with people and outside the family.
And so how do you make the case for getting people, top quality people, who would expect to have a legitimate say and not be overruled? Like, okay, I'm going to come in, I have an expertise. I don't want to be overruled by your son and your cousin just because they're your son and your cousin when I actually know more and I'm hired to know more. And so what's the persuasive case you make to reassure somebody with a lot of ambition who's not in the family that joining this business will be good for them?
I think first and foremost, if you want your family business or any business to be successful, you have to respect your experts. And we do. There's a difference between, ownership and clout. First off, any of the next generation that we bring, at least that I bring in, going forward, will have some experience outside the company and that thing. But despite that, when they come
would you, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but it just for our listeners, would you like your children to become a part of this business?
I would eventually.
Okay.
For a few reasons. One, because it's a great opportunity for them. Two, they'll be living in the same community as I am. And so I can be a part of watching my grandkids grow up.
Yeah, sure.
And three, I really like what our company has done for our community. And if we were to sell out and take money and run, the next owners are not going to invest in the community the same way that I know my children will. They grew up there. They love it. They love their friends, and it's home. It's their life. But I think to answer your question, one, you have to respect experts. And we do. We don't. When I came in and I was young and I thought I knew more than an expert, it was quickly explained to me that I did not, and that we bring experts in and we trust them to do their jobs, to do the things that we want them to do. And so we give them ownership of their area of responsibility and allow them, that's their part of the kingdom, and we respect them. And people that we know are competent and that are helping us to be successful, while we do not extend to them equity, we certainly seek to pay them well. We're well aware of the other benefits our company has where you can live. Living in a small town and not having to be a farmer or a rancher, but you can be an accountant or an engineer or something like that, might not be attractive to everybody, but there is a certain segment of the population that's very attractive to. And so I think by trying to take that concept of family and growing it through the whole company, not just the company, but our relationship with the community, makes it very attractive to our key employees. And while they're not in an equity position in the company, they feel like they're part of the greater family, and that what they do matters, and they buy into the vision that we have for our company. And, we don't have a lot of turnover as a result of it. I think we do a really good job of being clear who and what we are and why we do it. And if this appeals to you, and then come work with us. If it doesn't appeal, and we're clear at the beginning, equity will not be part of the deal.
Yeah. It's the family business is not getting diluted.
Yeah.
If I'm an expert, and let's say there's a key position, like is your CFO a family member?
He is not.
So let's say that your current CFO leaves and I come in and I'm a great accountant. I've got a great background. I want to move to this place, and it would be a perfect fit. But I say, look, I need 5%.
Then not only is it not going to be a good fit right off the bat, but is the 5% really going to satisfy you? Because that just puts you in a minority position.
I think also like most jobs, you don't get equity.
That's true.
So that part isn't as much of an issue as, hey, I might want to promote up to CEO, and that's not an option that's ever going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important for our listeners they're probably surmising this, but there are 1,000 different ways to structure a family business.
Absolutely.
And so you can extend all kinds of ownership to other people.
And a lot of times the salary for your experts can be higher than the salary for your family members.
Because they are getting equity.
Because they are the one, they're getting the wealth. And if you pay people fairly, that somewhat is proportional to the wealth they're helping you to generate for you and your fellow family members, in our experience, most people are content. I think that, if you're honest up front that the equity is not available, but if you are generating wealth and helping us to generate wealth, we're going to compensate you well. Yeah. We're only going to be successful if we've surrounded ourselves with successful people.
And so talk about some of the challenges of the family part of the family business. Let's say that your kids come in and you have 4, and let's assume that 3 of the 4 come in, and that of those 3 that come in, they all have spouses. And so let's just say for simplicity, you have 6 people working for you in this next generation. How do you allocate jobs in a way that best matches them? And then what do you do with the natural variation in capabilities and desire to work?
I think the honest answer is those things are always growing and changing. You're talking about your kids.
And their spouses.
And their spouses. And so there's a great deal of unknowns there and how people are going to react and to deal with it. I think that, one thing I start with is I want to make sure that they have proven to themselves and proven to the staff that somebody outside of the family respects them and is giving them some level of management responsibility. And the other thing with it is, to answer your question, some of it is dictated by the opportunity that's available at the time that they join. All right. You can sit back and try to come up with a grand design of your life and when you think you're going to back out and how you want it organized, but then that's got to coincide with the life schedules of lots of other people. And so I think my answer to you is you have to be flexible and forthright and honest from the get-go. And part of what people need to know when they join is circumstances can change. That's why I commented at the very beginning that, the time to divvy out equity might not be when they first join. I don't know if you call it a vesting period or those sort of things, but you want to, you don't really know how they're going to react to the concept of a family company until you get it. And so kind of the conclusions I've come to is I'd like to see people join. I think to a certain extent, you even need to leave it up to them to kind of figure out roles and how not to step on each other's feet. I think they've got to be involved in that process because they are the next generation of the executives. And so you're hoping that they'll own it. And I think having them involved in the process when that time comes, and I'm not an expert, we haven't gone through that yet. My kids are still finishing up jobs and getting their low-level management experience before any opportunity. And right now I'm still in a partnership with another brother-in-law of mine, and he would have to be comfortable with anything like that as well. And so, but I think my advice that I would say is you got to be flexible. I think you do need to involve them in the defining of it. While you may think that you've got all this experience and you know more, and you very well may, you're probably correct that you could sit down and organize the responsibilities a lot more efficiently and effectively, and their skill sets, and you can put the right person with the right one. And all of that's true. It is absolutely crucial that you have their buy-in. And I think the best way to get that buy-in is to involve them in the process of how you're going to define it. In our operations, sometimes it's easy because we have state boundaries. You can do it based upon if somebody has a more technical background, you're involved with the engineering and that. And So, I mean, I think it requires you to be flexible. My advice is to involve them in the process, and then that they also have to be flexible because these things are changing.
And so let's say that somebody listening to this podcast is a manager and they have a job offer from a family business and they've never worked in one before. And now they have an offer to be a mid-level or above manager in a family firm. What things would you tell a potential manager about to join a family firm? What should they look out for? What are some key questions they should ask? And what's the kind of vibe that you want them to get so that they know that they're making a good decision?
I would ask them to get very clear questions as to what their career track potentially could be.
Okay.
And where it will be limited. How far can I go as far as title and position? I think I would have clear expectations of, what is your model of compensating people who do a great job for you and help your family to generate wealth? What if we learn that I'm more competent? Maybe this is probably
It's a good
not
question.
the best thing to say at an initial interview, but if I'm the one interviewing you and I've got somebody that's that confident that says to me, what's your model in compensating me if we come to the conclusion that I have a significant role in the wealth that's being developed for you and your family members? What are you going to do to treat me fairly under those circumstances? I think those are good questions to ask, because then you're getting it out in the open, that you're not naive. That I understand that I'm never going to be the CEO, but I've got your commitment as an employer that if I am responsible for generating wealth for you and your family members, that you're going to figure out ways to either pay me more, nice bonuses, commissions, whatever it could be. And I think you get that out in the interview process, and you've got to be comfortable that you trust them. I think there's huge benefit to working in a family company. You have daily interaction with the executives, with the owners, the shareholders, the people who are going to make the real decisions concerning the direction of that company. Even if you don't have equity, but you work in a family company and you're a high level manager, in a lot of ways, you have far more control over your own destiny than you would in a huge company where you never get to interact with the shareholders, because you're making direct influence on them that's going to have an impact on them when they need to make decisions concerning the future of the company. And so it really, I think the key is, first off, am I comfortable? Can I be content if I'm not a shareholder? Is that going to eat away at me? And you got to be honest with yourself about that. Okay.
Again, most people are on career paths where they're never going to get equity.
Right. But
they're not going to be as close to the equity holders as you are.
Right. I understand.
They're rich people who bought it on the stock market or whatever.
I mean, I think generally speaking, most people who are expecting to be an employee are not expecting to be equity.
But in Kip's company, they're not going to be CEOs either.
I know. Yeah. That's a different problem.
But at the same time, I think certainly from our organization, you can't have that influence of a CEO. If you prove yourself that competent, we're going to really respect your opinions and rely on you to help us to grow. And I imagine any family company that wants to be successful is going to do things likewise.
Yeah, we would. As the hosts of a management podcast, we would recommend that people do that.
Yeah.
But as business consultants, we know that sometimes people don't do what they should do.
Sometimes they don't do what's best for the company, but they do what is best for their emotional state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a consideration, is, how much of the family potential drama is actually playing out in the organization. Because if it's high drama, then logic isn't winning. And you may not want to touch it.
You do not want to be a part of that company because it's not going to be successful.
Yeah, like in the news so many months ago, Paramount. Is it Paramount?
Paramount was for sale, for sure.
Yeah. And so, a lot of the reasons why I think it's for sale and some of the challenges they've had selling it have been family problems. I mean, initially it was the daughter fighting with the dad. And then it was the daughter fighting with the professional CEO. And in the end, the daughter won, Sherry Redstone.
Okay.
But as all this is playing out, their assets are dwindling because they're a quote unquote older media kind of holding, right? A film company, a cable TV company in an era when there's more streaming and people are not getting as much cable TV as before. And so it's just a well-known example of some of the dysfunction that sadly does pervade. I mean, there's dysfunction in all businesses.
And there's dysfunction in all families. But when the two are combined, it can make it very difficult for the organization to thrive, but also very difficult as an outsider to actually be an employee.
I don't think we had those problems in my company.
No, I'm not saying that you do. I'm just pointing out that that's one of the considerations is,
right.
Like if I'm looking around at the structure and I see that there are other people in influential positions in the organization who are not part of the family and people stay for a long time, then I'm more comfortable joining that family business. But if I'm picking up on politics and family drama, then
I would recommend to stay clear. Nowhere's utopia. Any work environment or work situation is going to have advantages and disadvantages. When I was in the Army, so much of the Army was dictated by your boss. If you had a good boss, I didn't want to do it for a career, but it was a really great job at the time.
And that's the same, I think, in organizations.
Yeah. And when I had bosses that I didn't like, they could make your life even more miserable, it seemed like, in the Army than what could be done on the civilian side. And to be in a family company where the family is dysfunctional, I would get as far away from that as I possibly could. For family companies to be successful, they have got to be a well-functioning family. That family needs to put first things first and needs to be committed to getting along and those sort of things. And if they struggle with that, you show up at the interview and, the son-in-law is complaining about his father-in-law to you at your first interview or something like that, I would say thank you very much and go elsewhere.
I think there's and unfortunately it didn't get published because I have looked everywhere for it. At a work in progress lunch, a faculty member from USC had come in and was, talking about his research, and he had data, but it was basically testing out this idea of the third generation loses it all, right? Like that's the saying as it goes. And his findings were, it's not necessarily the third generation that loses it all. It's when the person who's taking over the family business, when it shifts, like usually to build a family business, you actually have to have what you have described, which is a more community collective focus, right? You're not doing it just for you to make money. You're doing it to create a world for your family and potentially the community that you live in. And that really works. Like, especially in small towns, but I think even in large cities, like you can break it down into a large city into smaller pieces. You have to be part of that community because then people are rooting for you.
Yes.
And to be part of that community means you got to put something into that community. And so it's not a mystery how founders of family businesses, and again, like this was a study I can't find, but I would go out on a limb and say are likely to be more community focused. And what he had found was that by the third generation, there's a tendency that one of the offspring has become self-focused and is now about themselves and the money and what's in it for them. And it basically blows everything apart.
Yeah, because it's a competing culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a competing culture, but also like it's missing key principles of running a business, which is,
investment.
There's a community focus. And, it's not just like, there's a lot of other stuff. There's finance and everything like that. Like, that's what you're talking about and making some right moves. But if you don't have the backing of your customers
or your employees,
and they become your employees.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the pool that becomes your employees. You're an island and you're not going to make it.
Yeah, there's no question, in our experience, I mean, you could even see it in my wife's families. As the company got more successful, her younger siblings, grew up a bit differently than she did. This exists. And I think the only way you deal with it is you have got to teach your children these values of the company and our communal approach, and us trying to bring benefit to the community is great for business and is a big part of it, but it really has to be.
It has to fill you.
It has to be consistent with who you are.
Yeah.
And I think if you make decisions on hiring your children, that has to be, part of the fact is, are you generous? Are you really in this for the long haul, or are you greedy? Are you the prodigal son, if you will? And in that circumstance, maybe you just create a mechanism to give that child of yours a piece of the pie, so to speak, that is independent of the company. Because if you bring in somebody who does not share those values, has not adopted them, despite your best efforts to imbue that upon them in raising them, that can ruin the whole thing and tear it down. And so hopefully in those circumstances, you can figure out a way to share the wealth that has been generated with that member of the family, to treat them, quote unquote, fairly, if you will, but yet at the same time, be very wise and judicious in the opportunities within the company that is extended to that family member if they have not embraced that, we're making the world a better place with what we're doing. And if you are selfish and you only want to use this for your own individual betterment, which is, the evaluation that we've come to about your character, maybe you give them that money and treat them fairly, but, let them do it elsewhere. Yeah. But to answer your question, from my experience and my religious upbringing and all these things come into it, that people know if you're BSing, and so if you're not true, if you really don't believe in the core values of the company, people are going to recognize it. And so I think that the generation running it need to be honest about that, need to be honest about their own child and the negative impact that individual potentially could have if you put them in a position to influence the future of the company. To build on it, there's voting and non-voting shares. I mean, there are things you can do
that basically allow them to get their fair share,
limit
their negative impact.
Yes, to have any influence on the company.
Yeah, it's interesting that. So we were talking a moment ago about the Viacom. I think it's Paramount, Viacom, and some of that struggle in that company was because the father never relinquished control and just basically aged out. And I think he was in his 90s.
So he had no plan, which that happens all the time.
Yeah. And so, you're a thoughtful guy. We've known you for decades. How will you know when it's time for you to turn it over?
I think, I'm in the telecommunications industry and I feel old already, and so just, I have a son who's a junior in high school and he has to help me on my Delta app before I fly, and so.
It's not like you don't fly.
No, and so I know that day's coming soon. I think I go back to the same thing. You've got to be willing to be honest. You got to be willing to be honest about yourself. I think sometimes people take themselves too seriously, too often. They think that they are the source of the success. And you may be a great idea and a good manager in that, but there is always going to be a lot of people that work for you who are contributing to that success. And the probability is, Steve Jobs was pretty brilliant, but most of us aren't nearly as brilliant as we probably give ourselves credit to. And so I think the first step is not to take yourself serious. And that's hard to do if you're in charge of a successful company, because everybody that works for you is going to tell you how wonderful you are all the time. And so you have to find a mechanism
I think that's called having kids.
Yeah, kid. They help you to know how wonderful. Go back and meet your.
They seem to be humbling.
Hang out with your college roommates who can tell the world the stupid things you did when you were 18.
Oh, yeah, that's another mechanism.
All right, so go do that. And I think really at the end of the day, if you're not about you, probably these things will take care of themselves. I think if your family company has real core goals, all right, that extend beyond just making money. Why are we making money? What are we really doing to this? If your why are we making money is so that I and my kids can be wealthy, then you're not going to make it. Your company is not going to make it past the third generation. It just won't. I don't care who you are, how smart they are. Eventually that greed is going to create problems in that. But the ones that start these things, they have got to have the foresight to give it a little more reason to live than just making money, however you go about defining that. And if you make that and then you rally both your family and your company around that, I think it's got a higher probability of existing over the long haul. We all need to have something that convinces us, I don't know, maybe some people do just get it for money. And in my experience, most human beings want to have a reason for living above and beyond just making money. And if you can meld that into your company to some extent, then I think you're far more probable of it, going to successive generations and continuing to be successful.
Anything else you want to ask?
No, anything else you want to say?
I'll just say to the people of perspective, even if you're not inside the family, I think they're great opportunities. We've had great people work for us. We've tried to treat them well. They have a lot of influence on the decisions we make. If you're smarter than us, we recognize it. I mean, anybody who wants to run, in my opinion, anybody who wants to run a successful company wants to have people doing the jobs that are smarter than you are. That should be a goal, to hire people more capable than you are. And so I would encourage people not to be worried if they don't have equity. Equity and influence are not the same thing. And I reiterate back to the point I made that in a family company, even if you're not a member of the family, if you're an outsider, if you will, you do have more control over your destiny than a whole lot of jobs that exist in the world, because you do get to influence and interact with the decision makers.
And so in the benefit of the hindsight, are you glad you joined the family business?
Absolutely. And we've had our challenges, and not every day has been wonderful. There have been disputes and disagreements, but, I'm in business with good people and people I trust, people I leave my kids with, when I go on vacation. And
oh, come on. You take your kids with you.
I do take my kids with us a lot.
I insist roommates.
I insist that
That's right.
I insist that I spoil my wife and I, and she insists the kids come along. But, the point being, I'm in business with, their aunts and their uncles. And that's a big deal. There are challenges bridging all those gaps, but it's worth it. And they can be overcome. And I think that, they have their core values. They're good people. At the end of the day, they care more about the type of human beings that they are and getting along than whether or not we make all the correct decisions. I mean, we still got to be successful. There are times where, you will have to put your foot down and say, we're going to get along, but we're not going to be stupid. But at the same time, there are other times that you can say, all right, this may not be the best, but we'll be okay going in this direction. And it makes sure that we're still unified, and being unified is sometimes more important than being right.
As my mother says, I'd rather be wrong than dead right.
There you go. That's very well put. Family business, it is. It's a bit like, to me, like a bit like a marriage, and as I often say, I'd rather be unified in marriage than be correct.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in a family business, you have to be that way. And that can lead to failure at times, but it also can lead to people getting along. And I think if you do get along, it's more likely your business is going to be successful.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on Management Muse. We will see you the next time. We appreciate any comments, likes, follows,
all that stuff. Subscribe,
all the stuff, depending on what platform you're on. We appreciate it all. Anything that helps raise our visibility It's
Sure.
It's great.
All right. We'll see y'all next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today on Management Muse. We are a podcast / YouTube channel that we hope is entertaining and educational. If you are on YouTube, we would appreciate you subscribing and maybe leaving a comment and a like. If you are on any of the podcasts listening to this, we would appreciate stars, following, comments, all the good stuff. We want to say thank you to Christina, Sarah, and Rebecca, and then, of course, everybody at Design at Work. And then just as a last-minute reminder, we also want to mention that we are management and communication professionals working in the field, but also have degrees that back us in science. All that being said, we are talking in generalities on this podcast. We do not actually know your particular situation. So proceed with common sense and maybe a little bit of experimentation on your end. And we hope that you make the world a more beautiful place by making work a more enjoyable place. See you next time on Management Muse.